Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining today. Happy New Year 2021 to everyone. Thank you for joining on another episode of Modern App Development on Salesforce. And today we're going to talk about JavaScript unit testing. My name is Mohit. I'm a developer advocate here at Salesforce, and I've been joined by Julian. Julian, do you like to introduce yourself?
Of course, first and foremost, Happy New Year, Mohit. I hope you had a very happy holidays with your family.
Yes, I did. I did.
And Happy New Year to all our audience that is watching us live right now on Trailhead Live. My name is Julian Duque. I'm a lead developer advocate here at Salesforce, working mainly with the Heroku team. And I'm again joining Mohit on this awesome series of modern app development on Salesforce platform.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you so much for joining us today. Okay, so before we begin, Julian, there's a forward-looking statement. So please do not make any purchasing decision based on anything forward-looking that we make in this presentation. So with that, Julian, I just want to take a moment and remind our viewers about this series and upcoming sessions. So Modern App Development on Salesforce series, we started last November in 2020. We started with the aim of giving a full spectrum of application development on Salesforce, including design, testing, and building solutions on Salesforce, and how we can use Salesforce and Heroku to scale our applications. So we have some upcoming sessions this month as well. We have 3 sessions lined up. I still get to the habit of writing 2020 there on the slides. Sorry about that. So I'll be changing that to 2021. But yeah, so we have 3 sessions lined up. After this session, we'll do 1 session on Apex testing and a couple more on application packaging and deployments, and then the final one on building CI/CD pipelines for Salesforce and Heroku applications. So with that, we want to dive into today's topic, that is unit testing. And Julian, a lot of us might be very, very new to unit testing. So I thought before we actually get into specifics of how to test JavaScript and how to test LWC using Jest, why not take some time to explore like what is unit testing, what is its significance, and why one should develop this habit of writing unit testing. So unit testing is a unit. It's as the name says, it's unit testing. So unit here is a module of code that can be independently tested. That means you isolate that code from all of its dependency and you test that. So really the idea behind unit testing is it ensures that your code is performing the task that it is intended to. Like, for example, let's say you have a logic written for summing 2 numbers, like a plus b equals, let's say, c. Then what you want to do is provide a and b and make sure that c is exactly similar to what you intend to. Right. So that is unit testing actually in nutshell. And we do follow unit testing for Apex. We have Apex testing sessions as well coming next. But today we want to focus only on JavaScript specific. So before that, I want to take some time to highlight some of the primary benefits of unit testing. A couple of benefits from my experience, Julian, has been, it makes it really easy for me to identify regression bugs if I have tests sort of automated as a part of our CI/CD. So for example, if I have automation tests already sort of written, then what happens is, let's say I'm making a code change, those tests are going to run automatically for me next time when I submit a PR. And if I'm breaking, definitely not intentionally, but unintentionally, let's say I sort of broke the code, the CI/CD will let me know that I've broken this specific unit test, so that I can go and fix those bugs very easily. And also, Julian, as a software developers, we know that once you actually build an application and sort of push it to, let's say, production, once it gets into production and customers start using it, the cost of fixing the bugs after that is definitely higher than if you fix a bug initially, because there's a lot of factors that comes into picture, right? So unit tests are one way to actually reduce that cost by investing upfront, by making sure that you write a lot of unit tests, positive tests, negative tests, regression tests. So you break your code into units, and then you write tests for every unit to make sure that you're basically your code is working as expected, in case you break something in the future. So Julian, would you like to take us through your experience of working with unit testing, or how do you find unit testing in JavaScript in general?
Sure, sure. And you said one word that for me it's all about testing, which is it works as expected. So for me, testing is to manage the expectations of my code.
Hmm.
And most of the test runners or frameworks that you are going to use to run tests, today we are going to be focusing on one, which is the de facto standard for Lightning Web Components. But most of the tests, you are going to find that they use a expect function. So
Hmm.
pretty much it tells us that we are managing the expectations of our code. And it's also a very good way to write the specs or the specifications of our code, how our code needs to work in certain scenario.
Hmm.
So unit testing is one of those muscles that we developers need to train, because at the beginning, and I must say that it's hard to get the grasp of it.
Yes.
People think that writing tests might be a waste of time, that I need to spend that time writing code directly instead of spending time writing the test.
Yeah.
But that is not true, because of what specifically are you saying here in this slide, is that is going to save you a lot of trouble in the future. When
Yep.
you change code, you are going to make sure you are not breaking anything. And mostly when you are working with more people, when you are normally on a solo project, you have a lot of control, because sure, you have all of the context in your head. Sometimes if you, like me for example, don't code since 2020 and you come back to another to the same project, you might forget a bunch of things. So
Right.
making sure you have a test suite allows you to have a documentation of how your code needs to work and what are the different expectations. And if you are working with more people, you are making sure that not only you but other people that are contributing to this code doesn't break it. This is why in open source it is very important when you are contributing to a project. The best way to start learning about that project is to go and read the tests. When you
Hmm.
go and read the test, you are making sure how that project works and how the internals of the project works, what are the expectations. And if you are going to send a pull request, make sure that that pull request is not going to break a test, and that include a specific test case. So tests start to become like a very important aspect of a code project.
Okay, awesome. Okay, awesome. So in this session, Julian, what we're gonna do is we're gonna live code. We're gonna take, the e-cars application that we have been sort of discussing so far in the series, and we're gonna take one specific component, the car configurator component. I'll walk you through that component and what it does, because writing unit tests, as you said, also involves a little bit of understanding of what that application does, and what that code does, before we start writing. So we're going to take that application e-cars, we're going to take a component and start writing jest tests for that, live here for our audience. But before that, I want to make sure that, jest is, not only for testing LWC or LWC OSS app, right? We use it because it's easy to use, it's open source, and it's very popular. Now you can use jest to test your JavaScript in general. So there are specific things here in Salesforce that we add. For example, we have our own wrapper library over the jest that is called SFDX LWC jest that I'm going to show you, and that is a required dependency here to test LWC inside the Salesforce core. But in general, the jest framework can be used to test any JavaScript code that you write. It's it's one of the frameworks. Now, Jest is not only the framework. There are many frameworks like that, and I'm pretty sure, Julian, you might have come across things like Mocha or Sinon or things like that, right? So there are Jasmine. Jasmine is another popular one. So there are so many frameworks, but just because looking at the industry trend, and there's a lot of popularity for Jest, and we have our libraries for LWC Jest. We'll use Jest to do our unit testing, and that's what we sort of officially sort of recommend, and officially have certain wrappers around it.
Yeah,
Okay.
Jest is widely used. It has a great community support. It also supports Node.js projects, so you can test Node.js projects using Jest. It has
Yeah.
a like great tool integration, as you are going to show right now.
Yeah.
Integration it has with Visual Studio Code. So yeah, it's a recommended test runner. There are like multiple ones out there. Maybe if you are going to need a very something like something very simple for an Node.js project, I personally are going to use Tap or Tape, which
Okay.
is a more lightweight test runner. But if your project is going to be a little bit more bigger and you're going to be contributing with a bunch of people, Jest is going to be the way to go.
Okay, awesome. So if you can see my screen, right, Julian? So, there are these are the toolings that will be required, especially to follow this the activities that we're going to do today. You will need Salesforce CLI. You'll also need Visual Studio Code extension pack for Salesforce. So if you're a Salesforce developer, you already have these. But if you are coming from Heroku or you're a new developer, you should have these tooling in your belt. We also covered a lot of content around this in our first part of the series. So in our first few episodes. So you might get the recordings for that in our YouTube channel and also on the Trailhead Live, and you can watch them if you're not familiar with it. But we're going to use that. And there is one more extension, Julian, that I sort of downloaded from, it's an open source extension from Jest community. It's called VS Code dash test, and it is available in the Visual Studio Code marketplace. And this project is open source, and the entire reason why I picked this extension, and again because our advocate team actually introduced me to this extension, and they sort of use it because it runs the Jest in the watch mode, and it also helps to highlight the lines of the code that's not covered when I'm writing my Jest test. So basically, when I write test, I want to make sure that I've covered all the all the lines. When I say I covered all the lines, means I have tested all the lines of the code here. Now, if I miss something, it clearly sort of identifies that this is the line of the code that you have not sort of written tests for. So it makes it really easy, and also it has auto completion and things like that. So it makes it really easy to work with. Again, it's an open source project. And it's called VS Code Jest, and I'll show you how to sort of use it. So if you go to your extension marketplace, right, search for Jest, and one of the things you will get is Jest. So it says use Facebook's Jest with pleasure. So this is the one. It's quite popular, as you can see. Almost 500,000 downloads. So it's quite popular. So have that in your tool belt so that it makes really easy to see those coverage, etc. So how about, Julian, we take a look at the application, the eCars application, and the component that we are going to write the test for. So our org is opening now. Before that, right, I also want to have one more slide that I put together. And this slide, Julian, I put together because a lot of the unit testing frameworks, right, be it Jest or be it Apex testing, they all follow the same pattern. Irrespective of the language that you're using, they all follow the same A pattern or AAA pattern, right? Where what you do initially, and you will see that I'll follow exactly the same approach here. That is, you first arrange, so in arrange, what you do is you set up the objects to be tested, you configure your desired state, you configure your dependency, then you act upon it. That is, you call the method with the dependency and capture the output. And then lastly, assert, which is what our expectation, we've been calling expected values, right? So we assert or make claims about the outcome, right? So whatever the returned value or the desired state is, we make sure that that is exactly what it it is supposed to be, right? And we write asserts everywhere, and let's say, if it's not as expected, our tests are going to fail, right? So why don't we come back to that component and see what we're going to write today. So Julian, this application, right, showroom application, if you're not familiar with it, we have covered it throughout the series. This has a really nice component called car configurator. And this component, again, the reason why I picked up is because this is a little complex component compared to other components where it was only like read-only view, but it has a lot of interactions. Like, for example, you can select the range, you can go to the next, you can pick up the exterior color of the car, and then you can choose the interior colors for the car and press next, right? So there's a lot of interactions happening, and also you select the lead, and then finally you generate the PDF, right? So there's a lot of interactions. Julian, you want to talk about something else here?
No, I was
okay, awesome. Yeah, so essentially, basically there's a lot of interactions that are happening in this component. So I thought this is a good component for us to actually take a look at it and see how we can test certain things, right? Okay, so let's get back to Visual Studio Code, right, where we're gonna code this, right? So I have the project already set up, and I have scratch arc configured. Again, scratch arc is needed to just view our component, but I want to make it clear, Julian, that scratch arc is not needed to write your unit tests. In fact, all the unit test execution happen on the client side, and there is no server involvement at all. So let's say if you are offline, if you're not over the internet, you can still code your test cases. You don't need to be online.
I have a question. Can we use the Lightning local development server to test?
That's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question, Julian. So actually, again, as I said, it's client side, so there's no connection to local development server as well, right? But you can use your local development server, which is now called Code Preview, to just preview the component. Let's say if you're offline or you're off internet, you can still, sort of preview all these components by starting the local development server, and then you can preview that code, and then basically you can write. But there is no involvement of local development server. Okay, so Julian, yeah, so let's look at this code, Julian, just so that we have an idea of this code before we sort of start writing the test. So we have like 4 sections here, right? And then we have some base components, and then we have some button actions for the next click that you saw. So every next action, what we are doing is we are configuring these parameters here, like each section is basically, we have 4 different getters, I think, for denoting the sections, right? So based on the current section, we return what's the section selected, and we conditionally sort of render our markups, right? So that's one use case to actually test, right? To make sure that we click through those buttons, we go to different sections and see if all our markups are proper, they have the proper data that's supposed to display. So usually, Julian, when I write test for, right, I do not test the static text because it's static, right? It's not changing. But if there is a logic involved, like for example, ranges have, it's an object in the backend and things might change, right? There might be a change to the state of the component, so we might want to check that the state is actually as desired, right? So we have these 4 sections, we have some buttons, we have some actions on the anchor links, etc. So we can test, and we can be really creative and come up with a lot more tests, but write meaningful tests. That's the core thing. Like whichever functionality you feel like it's the crux, right? It's the main functionality. You should test that, so that it stays intact when you next time modify the code. Okay, so how about, Julian, we start writing the test, right? So I have those configured, and Julian, one of the things that is important to configure here is obviously when you scaffold your Salesforce project, there are certain things that you will see in the script section that will automatically come. Like for example, things like test, right, where it runs the test unit, which basically calls the LWC jest function, or invokes that LWC jest. So this thing, Julian, it automatically provided by the CLI. So the moment you scaffold a Salesforce project, you will see that a package.json will have these scripts for you automatically. And one of the things is you just run the npm install so that you get all these libraries that are required for you to run run the jest, right? So one of the thing is I was talking about was, we make use of this library. So we have this library called sfdx lwc jest, and that is, again, it's a wrapper over jest essentially. But the core advantages of this library is it has lightning stubs for all of the base components. Now you might be asking me, like, what is a stub, right? What is a stub? What is a mock, etc.? So stub is essentially a predefined templates and JavaScript that's predefined for you, and that's what returns when I'm calling this specific. So instead of actually going to the actual code path, it'll go to the stub, and whatever is there in the stub, it will reflect back, right? So it's basically like it's like an interface, you can think of it. So the reason why we want to use this sfdx lwc jest library and have this is because it provides you all those stub, and I don't have to manually sort of code all these stub in my code base, in my actual code base. So it kind of reduces it, and they have stubs for different base components. Now if something is not there, we can also write stub, and I'll get back to that later as we progress along here. So as you can see, in the dev dependency, you will have you'll have a jest, lwc jest, so this one, right, at Salesforce / sfdx lwc jest, right? We will have that. And also, what else we have? So we have also the Sally jest, right, Julian? I'm not going to get into this, but this is basically, Sally is our accessibility framework. It's basically an integration JavaScript module that works with Jest so that you can test for accessibility. So when I say accessibility, there are certain people in our community, who might need some more assistance. They might be using lots of devices, to read the HTML markups, right? So this ensures that, whatever the writing Jest using Sally framework ensures that you also test for accessibility. And there are a lot of sessions, there are a lot of developer blogs on our blog that we have done on this using Sally and how to use this for accessibility testing. But today I want to just focus on, code testing using sfdx lwc jest.
Mohit, I have a question for you.
Yeah, please.
And this is specifically for the people that are new to testing.
Yeah.
You are using a term and maybe two terms that are very specific to testing.
Yeah.
To see if you can explain them. What is a stub and what is a mock?
That's an excellent question, actually. What is a stub versus a mock? And this always actually confused me in the beginning, but the more and more I kind of worked through, it sort of made more sense. So in a stub, right, Julian, what you do is you just have the interface for it. Like, you don't sort of do any specific logic or any you do not return anything except the predefined values. Like, for example, these are all stubs. So if you look at one of these stubs, they don't have any logic in them. It just says that this is the accordion component, and it exposes two of the properties, and then this is the HTML, right, which has a slot element to it. So a stub is you can think of it as an interface. So it's just a definition with predefined values, so that's what a stub. So and then what is a mock? As you said, mock is where we actually mock the values. For example, let's say in LWC test, right, we don't want, whenever there's a call to an Apex, we do not want to actually go to that Apex server. We want to mock that response, internally, right? So that's a mock, where you mock it up, right? So instead of going to the real modules, you mock it up, into your own responses, right? So that's mock. And we Jest has this, if you go to the Jest website, right? So if you look for just mock object, right, Jest has this nice way of, they provide you various methods so that you can mock JavaScript object, you can mock the JavaScript property, you can mock the JavaScript functions, you can mock a JavaScript class, and you can also mock a JavaScript module. So basically they provide you all sorts of capabilities so that, let's say you want to change a real behavior of something for only the test context, then you can use this jest.mock to mock it up. Like, there are some examples here, and we'll get into some of them. Like, so they have this jest.function where you can say, okay, I want to mock this specific module into a response of, let's say, X structure, right? So you basically predefine your structure and then you can mock it up. So let's actually get into code and start writing some code. So again, Julian, so we need all these dependencies and we need npm install. I've done it. I've also created a branch because, we lack test coverage in this specific application. For all other sample gallery apps, we have test coverage, so do look at them. For this one, we're still working on it. So I thought this is a good use case where we take this and start actually doing some coding, right? So car configurator, again, so we create the test scaffold inside the same directory, Julian. And the way we do it is through the Salesforce CLI, actually. So what I do is I just take the file path, right? And there is this CLI command called sfdx force, and then we have lightning, and then we have lwc. It's a long command, Julian. So just bear with me here. And we showed you how to create a task.json in one of our sessions. So if you create a task.json, you don't have to type, but I really wanted to type this time so that I can show you the command. So basically this says, Julian, that create a test scaffold for a file, which is the car configurator. So the moment you say yes, what will happen is it will create, as you can see, it created a test folder, right? And if you actually get inside the test folder, it automatically sort of created a skeleton code, right? A skeleton code. So pretty much every test that we will write will have a skeleton, and the skeleton will be same. Remember we talked about AAA pattern, right? Where you set up, you basically arrange and then you act upon it and then you assert, right? So that's why what is happening here is, since the patterns are same, what the team has done, the CLI's team has done, is they have actually given us a wrapper, and I'll quickly go over that. So basically you start importing that LWC module, and you know that this is like the core module that is required for creating an LWC component, right? And what is interesting is if you try to do this, Julian, in your actual code, this will not work because we don't allow you to use the create element in the actual code. It's only meant to create the elements in the test context. So now, Julian, what we'll do is we basically import that module that we want to test, right? The car configurator. And then what this describe function is, describe is basically a suit, right? So you have a component, you have a suit, a test suit, right? It's basically a test suit. You can think of it as it's a collection. Like you can group all the collections of the test within a test suit. That's what describe does. So you say a describe, and then it has a so this is, again, this is classic that ES6 way of saying a function, right? So it has a function basically where it has this after each, which is basically so here is where the comment clearly says like what we do with after each. So the JS DOM instance. Now what is JS DOM, right? So JS DOM is because this is running on a client side, right, and not on a browser. JS DOM is again an open source library that sort of implements all the DOM APIs, in the npm module, right? So that's what JS DOM does, and Jest actually works with the JS DOM. That's how the Jest works. So basically here what we do is after each we say, we want to remove the child, which is basically the the first child here is the component itself, right? So for every test case, now I can have multiple test cases here, right? So for every test case, we want to make sure that we start fresh, and that's what this after each is doing. It's basically, since the same instance of the JS DOM is shared across the test, right? So we reset the DOM essentially. So, and this is needed for all of the use cases, so we're going to keep this like that. Now this is where it starts, right? So it says it, and this is your test case actually. So you document what is your test case. Like for example, here I want to say, okay, I want to check that this component renders section 1, right? Renders section 1. So that's what I want to test, right? It renders this section 1 here in my code. It renders fine, because if you look at our JS file, right, what it does is it has so it has all the default sort of setup, right? And by default, we say, okay, the current section that you want to render is the first section, right? So we want to check that the first section is rendered properly, right, when this component sort of initializes. So that's what we are testing. So we say render section 1, right? So what does it do, right? Usually that's what you should do. Like it renders section 1, right, successfully or something like that. You can name it, and then we have this function, right, where we say, okay, create the component, right, the car configurator component using that create element, and then we say attach it to the DOM element, right? And then we can start writing the exceptions, the expectations here, right? So as you can see, it by default said, okay, this did not run successfully because this is a boilerplate code and our expectations are not right. We are saying 1 to be 2, which is not correct, right? So let's actually do something that is write expected values. Now what I want to do, Julian, is here in this test, I want to make sure that we query back the image div, that is this one, right? So we want to make sure this image got rendered, right? So let's see how to do that. So pretty simple. I'm going to get rid of this expected thing. We don't need to do that, right? We need to first query. So I'm going to say const, and let's say image div is what I want to query for, or image, right? So image, let's query for the image. And again, it's a JavaScript, right? So everything will be in the shadow root of this. Again, a web component. This is a web component, right? So any markup, right, like this, like image or this div, all of them will be inside this. It'll be inside the what do you call it? So it'll be inside this web component, right? So basically, we have this shadow root. Right, so shadow root is where if I say element.shadow root, it'll give me all the DOM elements inside the component, right? So this is the whole template, and inside that is the shadow root, right? Now once I'm in the shadow root, I can write a query selector just like standard JavaScript query selector. So we basically say query selector. So because this is an image tag, right, I want to say image, right? Now why is okay? So you see it says that there are no assertions here, right? So it's gonna scribble and complain because you don't have assertions. So I'm gonna say img because img is the right one. Okay. So now once I have this, Julian, what I can do is I can basically make sure that this thing is rendered or not, right? There's one more key thing to understand here, Julian, is what Jest does is, let's say if your component is sort of rendering or re-rendering, after a state change, you have to resolve the promise. And that is how the Jest behaves, when you're testing your asynchronous code, is, you have to make sure that you resolve the promise so that all the component is, sort of refreshed to the latest state, right? So we can do that by simply returning a promise. So we can say promise dot resolve, and then this promise dot resolve has this then function, again modern ES JavaScript, right? Where you can actually say, okay, this is a function essentially, right? So what you need here is a return function. So this has to be a function. So I'm gonna say function, and then this. We're gonna format this better, but let's just keep going here. Okay, so yeah, so in this one now I can write my expected value, right? So I can say expect. So what is the thing that I'm expecting, right? I'm expecting that my image component, right? Like image component. Let's see the property of the source, right? src. So I can say image dot my src, and they have this different matches. These are called matchers actually, and there are so many matches, as you can see. To be called, there are plenty of matchers here, right? So we can say to be, what would be its value, right? So its value will be, so we know what are we passing as a constant, right? So we have been passing the, what's the URL here? So let's see. So our URL is this guy, right? Okay, so let's just put it here, right? Now this is gonna fail because I know that there is okay, so this got failed as expected because I don't think this is the URL. So as you can see, it says it has to be /cars-y.jpg because I think that's our URL, right? So if my expected value is not equal to received, it will say it's an errored value, right? And Julian, so one of the other things you can do here is really actually debug, so how you do that is by, so you see there's two things that got popped up from the VS Code extension. So you can just put a breakpoint here, just like how you do normally, right? And you can say, I want to debug the test, right? So you say debug the test, and you will see that it will actually stop there. So it's going to take some time because, it's inside the promise, but now it's, as you can see, right? So you can actually debug it right away. You can see the values, you can hover over the elements to actually make sure that, the values are coming, right? And you can put that breakpoint even within your code also when the test is happening so that you can inspect the values. So now we don't want to debug. We know our cause, so why it is actually failing, because it requires that white color, right? So if I trace this base image URL, our first value, right, for the first section is this guy, right? So we just put the value here, right? And now when I save this, so look, this is running in the watch mode automatically for me. So it actually ran, and now there's a beautiful green check which says, okay, you have successfully validated and your code is actually working fine.
So we can say that this test is for the default happy path.
Yeah, default happy path. Yeah,
then we will need to create test for the selector when we change the color, make sure we are selecting the proper image.
Yes.
And now you are getting the idea, or the people in the chat are getting the idea how the other test needs to be written. We are matching the expectations of how the selector works and this car configurator component works.
Yes, exactly. So Julian, why don't we write something else and see? Like, for example, I'm interested in actually, I want to see what these anchor values are, because this is inside, like if you look at this, right, this is really different because, it is going inside a template, and, it is iterated over a template, like iterated over ranges. And then there's different links that have got generated on the DOM. Like there are, I think the range object, right, is the first one, like this object, right? The ranges object, right? So this is like 3 number of elements have been generated. And I want to test, I'm curious to test that those range anchors to see, if these anchors are rendered on my page. Like there are 3 number of anchors here. I'm also curious to see what their range values are, right? Is it rendering fine, like how I send it in my JavaScript, right? And also, Julian, one of the key things I saw in this component is it doesn't use an API, like for example an API. So once you use an API property, or the decorator, we call it as decorator, right? Once you annotate a property with a at API decorator, then you can directly reference it by just saying element dot and the API property. But for this use case, Julian, because this component, you're modifying everything internally, and you're not this component is not exposing any property, right? That's why everything is internal, and that's why we have to come to the DOM and check. A lot of times you don't have to come to the DOM and check, if the properties has an API, because you can pass an API parameter directly. Like for example, here I can say element dot, right? I can say element dot and then the variable name and provide the values to it and see what is rendered. So you can do that, but this component is really interesting because it doesn't use any API at all. It just internally does the DOM manipulations and state manipulations. So why don't we check for this ranges, Julian, and see whether we have these 3 number of anchors here and whether the range values are actually populated correctly, right? Okay, so let's do that. So again, same thing. We can write one more test if you want. Let's do that actually just to showcase. But really not necessary. I mean, yeah, it's better to write different tests actually. So don't mix it up in one test, right? So renders, section 1 anchor tags, right? Anchor tags as expected. We can say renders image as expected, right? So let's do that. So now, Julian, so here instead of image, right, what we have is a reference tag. So I'm gonna say anchor, anchor elements. Now, Julian, so one of things is I cannot just say query selector here because that there are multiple of them. So by default the query selector will just match one of them and return the values, but this is more than one elements, right? So what we need to do here is say query selector all, because then that will return everything, right? So now what we want to do is we want to say, okay, so these are the anchors, right? So I'm going to say anchor elements dot length, right? Okay, length, right? So this length, I know that it has to be 3. And how do I know that, Julian? Is because I passed 3 number of objects in the beginning, right? So this has to be 3 if this test is successful. So we save it. Again, it will run automatically. As you can see, it just says yes, 3 elements are there. Let's say I had set it 4, it would have popped up and said, hey, that's not correct, So, and when you hover over it, it's going to say, hey, expected value is 4, but you've received 3, right? And then we can actually get into the attributes and also check them. For example, I want to make sure that our first element here, right? I want to say 0 dot, and here for example range, right? So this thing, right, Julian? So this is called, so for those of you not knowing about this, right, date/range, this is an HTML5 attribute, right? And this is a special HTML5 attribute that we can we have this special property called dataset. So by using the dataset, you can access any property. Like for example, we could have data dash something else as well, and you can create as many data properties. So you can access them very easily by using this special property called dataset. And that's so Julian, as you can see, I need to know a little bit of JavaScript to write these tests. I also need to know a little bit of HTML to write this test. So these are like very important skills to have. So if if you're first time writing code, just try to brush up a little bit on HTML5, right? Or JavaScript, like fundamentals of JavaScript. It's just JavaScript. So basically, so we can say range. Yeah.
I just shared the link on the chat, and we have a very interesting question from Abin.
Yeah.
It's 2 questions. One is, when we push the change to platform, is this gonna be automatically tested like Apex test coverage?
No.
So and the other one is, do we need to use a CI/CD tool to run the testing?
Yeah, that's a very very good question, Julian. That's a really nice question. So here's the thing, right? So it is not connected to the platform at all. So we are not pushing this code. When you do sfdx source push, Julian, it's not gonna push the test file at all. The test file is gonna stay in your source code. It'll not go to the backend server at all. So it's definitely not going to be pushed. And you can run this in your CI/CD very easily. All that you need to do in your CI/CD pipeline is you are seeing this package.json, right? So you see this test command, right? So all you need to do is say npm run test, and that will take care of linting it and then running this LWC jest for you and making sure it runs all the services. Like, basically in the services we say go into the e-cars application. So in this case, right, Julian, there's also a progressive web app, right? So we want to run the default folder of the Salesforce, and also
That's not for the progressive web app. That's for
oh, that's
testing
for
the
the
microservices.
service. Yeah, but
And
yeah.
for that project, we are using a different test tool. Remember that initially I mentioned one tool called Tab.
Tap. Okay.
So that's the one we are using there. This is something we added so you can check that you can also mix and match different test runners depending on the
Okay,
project.
awesome. Yeah, that's a good learning for me as well. So yeah, so basically, you see this test command. So you can say npm run test, and you can change things here. Like for example, npm run test unit is what will run the LWC jest test in your Salesforce project. But then let's say you also, let's say it's a mono repo where you have a Heroku application, a progressive web app, or a service like the one that Julian has. You can create test services and basically make sure you write all your scripting there and then point it out to that script as well. So thank you, Julian, for actually helping me understand this from an external developer's perspective. But yeah, so basically we check for the short range. Let's check for a long range as well. I think it's called medium range, I guess. We can see it here. Yeah, it's called medium range, and then the second value would be, so this is the first value, right? The second anchor element would be medium, and this will be long, right? So if everything is properly rendered, all of these anchor tags should just pass, and our tests are fast. Okay, there's something that is failing. What's that? Okay.
Yeah, the index.
Okay, the index. There you go. So that's the thing about writing the jest test. So there you go. So it's all passed, right? And there are also some specific, again, if you run things in watch mode, right? Now, one of the things I want to show you, Julian, is definitely I want to show you like how the coverage thing works, right? So for the coverage thing, let's save this file. So for the coverage thing, all that you need to do, Julian, is go here and say just toggle coverage. And this will toggle and tell us which lines it has like passed. Now it's running all the tests actually. So it's going to generate that coverage folder now. Okay, so there you go. So you see 40 files added. That's not what we want, but that's because, Julian, what happened is coverage files got added, those HTML, etc. And we can easily ignore them by just going to the GitHub, going to the .git ignore files. Where's that? Yeah, .git ignore, and let's just take off the coverage things that got added here. Okay, so perfect. So yeah, so here as you can see, Julian, so we covered few things, like we covered this line, so this line is not highlighted, but all other places we have not covered, and there's so much of work that we have to do, right? All the unit tests, right? So it actually shows that these are the areas that's not been covered, which is nice, because then I can, sort of keep writing my test code and keep increasing our coverage. Now, none of the things are mandatory in Salesforce. Like, it's not that if you do not write tests, we're going to stop you, unlike Apex. So, Julian, for those of you familiar with Apex, right, what happens, Julian, is in the Apex code, right, if you do not write the test, we don't allow you to deploy to production. That's how Salesforce works. But for this one, right, it's way different. We do not mandate it, but we strongly recommend that you write test cases like the one that I'm showing. Basically, let's do one more very quickly, Julian. We have 10 minutes, so I want to take some 5 minutes to do one more test, so let's do one for the base components, right? So far what we have seen is only the actual HTML elements. What if I have base components, right? So again, base components also we can test, right? Let's see. Okay, let's just copy. So this is how it always works, Julian, for me. Copy, because then we can modify and we can, so the next thing is render section 1, base components or formatted numbers. Fine, right? So in the base components, again, so I'm gonna say formatted number elements, right? So now, Julian, what you can do is, so this is the power is what you can do is you can just put this here, you can just put the name of the base components. That's all it is required, it just recognizes because of the stubs that I was showing you, right? So again, this will be 3, and then we can test for one of those properties. So one of the key things to remember here, Julian, is let's say we want to check for something like value, right?
Yep.
So what about if a component has like currency code, right? Like this. So we have to first make sure that a stub is available for it in that open source project that I was showing you. So for example, if I go to Lightning Stubs here, let's go to formatted, I think it was called formatted numbers, right? So we go here and we see what are the stubs that are available. So as you can see, currency code is available, right? So there's a key difference here. Like if you try to actually want to validate that, you have to make sure to write like this. You have to say currency code with C capital, so wherever there's a dash, it becomes capital, and you can get that just by looking at the stubs on how they have sort of exposed some of these, right?
And only for the ones that have like a public API.
Yeah,
Like
only for that you can access.
API.
Exactly. Otherwise, you will have to mock it up like how they have mocked it up, and I'm gonna get into that shortly. So let's just, in the interest of the time, right, Julian? So I'm gonna just say value. Let's just check the values here. Value, and these values, these values. Where are those values? So here are those values. So we go up. So 25,000, 35,000, and 45K. Okay. Yeah. So because they are numbers, just make sure that you put them like numbers. Otherwise, it's gonna automatically do the data conversion and say it's not correct. Okay. So here we go. So now, there are a lot more things here, Julian, that we couldn't cover again because of the time shortage. But I want to leave our viewers with one specific repo that I know has lots of tests and lots of scenario. So if we go to Trailhead Apps, go to LWC recipes repo. Now this repo is where you will find lot of jest tests sort of written. And here, if you go to LWC, you will see that we have lot of components. I think this has like almost more than 30 components or more than that. There's a lot of components here, and for every component, like for example, if I actually go to, let's take an example of events. So if you go to this, right, so if you look at the code, it basically is calling events. Maybe I go to HTML or JS and show. So for example, handle previous or handle next, right? So if you go to the jest test, you will see that we would have written a unit test for that. So as you can see, we'll show you how to sort of loop through the button and click it, and then how to also other things here, like for example wires, right? Like when you are using the wire adapter of Salesforce, like for example these wire adapters that come directly where you can call an Apex method. So for those also we have tests. So you can actually go here, look at the test that is there. You can see how we actually do it, right? So basically this SFDX LWC jest module, Julian, actually provides us something called as register Apex test wire adapter. It's a special function that they provide you. So what you do with that function, Julian, is you can basically register an adapter. So you can say register this Apex function. So for example, find contacts is the Apex method that gets, or the Apex function that gets called, right? So you register with that Apex adapter. Now what you can do with that is you can essentially emit a mocked response. So like as I was earlier mentioning, right, that you do not actually call the server, right? You have to mock the response. So for example, mock find contacts will be response. So as you can see, let me show you what happens here, right? So there is a folder, Julian, that where we keep the data. So you can create a data folder and you can have your data here, like the mock response, and you can just use that mock property to say, you can use the mock property. Sorry for the jump. Okay, so you can emit that mock responses, and then from there you can basically again verify with the same logic that I showed you. So there are a lot of examples like that. So really useful resource. And Julian, one of the other resources that, so I've compiled all the resources for you here. So if you're new to Jest, it's very interesting actually. When I went through Jest matches, configurations, Jest objects, etc. There is also a neat little trailhead module actually, which really I learned a lot of things from here. Especially I want to point out, Julian, to this one, like how do you mock other components. So go through this section and complete this trailhead module. This shows you how to create a module mapper. That means, Julian, what does it mean is, let's say you don't want to use one of their stubs. We saw that it automatically stubs some of the content from this, right? So let's say you have your own module, and let's say you want to sort of use your own stubs, right, Julian? So for that, what you can do is you can basically use that jest.config.js. Like for example, in this in this one, we don't have any we are just using all the out-of-the-box capabilities, right? But this file just.config.js has a lot more capability. That is, what you can do is you can create a module mapper. That means, let's say you want to create a stub for lightning button. You just create a section called module mapper, and you provide the path of that mock file. So if you look at our repos, like for example, a good example will be the LWC repo as well, right? It has several module mappers. So we create a folder called test/just mocks, and we create a mocks, like for example for the lightning message service, right, or the navigations or the UI record components. So we create our own stubs here, right? Like for example, here we are mocking certain functions by just function. For some of them we are returning our own responses, right? So you create those just mocks or the stubs, and then, Julian, we use this we use the jest.config file. So we use the just.config.js file to actually set up the module mapper. So you basically say, okay, wherever the module is lightning/platform show toast events, go look at the stub that is there in this folder path. And as you can see, it has to be the same name. Like for example, if you see lightning/platform show toast event, it has to be named also like that. That's how the just config work. Making sure that so the moment you want to mock something up your own, like you want to create your own stubs, you can do that using just.config.js, and this module will walk you through how to do that. And it has a lot of good content around it. So I think we are almost running here out of the time, right? Again, I want to remind to our viewers that we share all the slides on our chatter group, right? So we have a chatter group. So if you go to the Trailhead community here, so if you're on the Trailhead website, right, there is a neat little community that we have created. So join us on modern app development on Salesforce. And I'm going to share the slides here. It also has all the slides for the previous sessions, and also it also has some of the solution keys for some of the problems that we couldn't cover in last sessions, etc. like a step-by-step guide, right? So go and find those assets. Let us know if you are missing something, and we'll fix it. And also, I want to request, Julian, to our viewers that if you are practicing, right, feel free to contribute to our open source projects, especially the e-cars project. We are lacking in the coverage. We are definitely going to spend some time and write the test coverage for them. But feel free to contribute to this open source project. It is open source. Just you make sure to follow the contribution guidelines, and reach out to us. So with that, Julian, we should wind it up. So find our sample gallery apps, and catch us on Trailblazer community. And thank you so much for joining the live stream today.
Thank you all. Happy New Year, and see you